Hey everyone, in October I did a video entitled Questions for Biblical Inerrantists and Literalists, in which, among other things, I asked adherents of biblical inerrancy and literalism what they thought about their fellow Christians who did not embrace inerrancy and literalism, believers who populate the more moderate and liberal spots on the Christian landscape. My intent was to follow this up with a video about moderate and liberal approaches to Christianity. Well, it's taken a little over 2 months, but I've finally gotten around to doing the follow-up video, the first of what I suspect will be several. In the introduction to his Letter to a Christian Nation, Sam Harris says, quote, "I have set out to demolish the intellectual and moral pretensions of Christianity in its most committed forms. Consequently, liberal and moderate Christians will not always recognize themselves in the Christian I address." Some of my videos get the same reaction from moderate and liberal Christians here on YouTube. These believers simply don't see themselves and Christianity as they understand it in the beliefs and arguments I address and criticize. And I get that, because with the exception of my excursion into evangelical Christianity in my 20s, I was, for the bulk of my believing life, a moderate or liberal Christian who rarely identified with and was often horrified by many of the beliefs and practices of my conservative and fundamentalist co-religionists, people who I thought were, as the great Peter J. Gomes puts it in his The Good Book, Reading the Bible with Mind and Heart, using Christian orthodoxy as a protective coloration for mere prejudice and bigotry, both cultural and personal, and using the Bible as little more than a footnote to their convictions. Christianity, as presented to me in my formative years and as I embraced it in adulthood, was not about biblical literalism, fetishizing the human fetus, marginalizing homosexuals, and or thwarting sound scientific education in the nation's classrooms. Rather, it was about welcoming the stranger, feeding the hungry, comforting those without comfort, teaching the ignorant, and so on. I viewed conservative, fundamentalist Christian claims about biblical inerrancy, infallibility, and literalism as, at the very least, misguided. To be sure, I believed the Bible conveyed truth, divinely inspired truth even, but that did not entail believing it was without error and always conveying facts, historical and otherwise. Moreover, I viewed, for example, the catalog of ordinances in Exodus 21, including, without limitation, the bit about how one is permitted to beat one's slave as long as one doesn't kill the slave, because, after all, a slave is one's property. I viewed those as silly and cruel rules, obviously the product of primitive human minds in a particular time and place, and not the product of the mind of a loving, eternal, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God. However, when I embarked upon the process of reviewing my religious beliefs and why I adhered to them, the very hard work of destabilizing thought that ultimately led to my abandoning religious faith, among the first things I considered was whether the Bible truly gave me the option to dismiss such passages. The problem is that the Bible places permission to beat one's slave because the slave is one's property just as squarely in the mouth and voice of God as it does the declarations, "I love justice," "This is my beloved son," and "People with disabilities will, quote, desecrate my sanctuary." I wondered on what, if any, basis I could legitimately reject the Deus Dixit in Exodus 21 and Leviticus 21, but embrace the Deus Dixit about justice and Jesus as God's Son. This was a question I'd never asked myself, and after I did, one with which I wrestled for some time, not because it was an especially difficult question, but because in my heart I knew it had an especially difficult and ultimately faith-devastating answer. Apropos this, back in November, Theowarner, who seems to me to be a moderate or liberal Christian — Theo, if you reject that appraisal, please correct me — did a video criticizing the first episode of my Brief Bible Blunders series, a series that targets traditional notions of biblical infallibility, inerrancy, and literalism. One of the text comments under Theo's video cited the aforementioned ordinances in Exodus 21, which Theo summarily dismissed. Quote, "Stupid laws from a bygone time. Thank God no one takes them seriously." Now, while I agree, they are stupid, and I would add cruel laws that are best left in the past, I'm not laboring under the burden of religious belief here. And therefore, it does not matter to me that these stupid, cruel rules begin with the words, "God said." The Deus Dixit is meaningless to me. But ultimately, a believer, even a moderate or liberal one, either deals with this or simply ignores it, preferring to believe that his or her God would never say such stupid and cruel things, the Bible's unequivocal declaration to the contrary notwithstanding. The late Raymond Brown, a brilliant man and no religious fanatic, he, whose outstanding biblical scholarship I admire tremendously, says in his book, The Birth of the Messiah, that, quote, "Close analysis of the infancy narratives in Matthew and Luke makes it unlikely that either account is completely historical." I couldn't agree more. But the author of Matthew introduces his infancy narrative by saying, quote, "This is how the birth of Jesus Christ came about." The author of Luke claims his gospel is a carefully investigated, orderly account of Jesus' life. If neither is historical, then those statements are not true. What else in the Gospels and elsewhere may the believer legitimately reject as not historical? Why not every word? How does one know? This, it seems to me, illustrates one of the most significant problems at the heart of the moderate and liberal Christian enterprise. Simply put, the Scriptures do not extend to anyone an invitation to accept and reject their provisions and claims piecemeal. But that's precisely what moderate and liberal Christians do. Either the Scriptures are a collection of ordinary texts written by mere mortals on their own, or they are something more, much more, namely the Word of God, God-breathed texts, inspired by God, and therefore every word in them is necessarily flawless. I don't see a middle way here, no matter how intellectually satisfying and even spiritually noble the effort to forge one might seem. In the end, the difference between moderate and liberal Christians and their conservative fundamentalist counterparts is merely one of degree, not kind. All Christians dismiss some of the Bible. The difference is in the amounts rejected and the methods by which the rejection is accomplished. Moderate and liberal Christians do tend to be more straightforward about the fact that they reject large swaths of their scriptures. That said, I'd like to put to my moderate and liberal Christian viewers the question with which I wrestled during my transition away from religious faith. On what, if any, basis do you believe you may legitimately reject portions of your scriptures? In fact, let's contextualize this a bit. Here are the four biblical passages I mentioned earlier: Exodus 21:20-21, Isaiah 61:8, Matthew 3:17, and Leviticus 21:16-23. Now, according to the Bible, God himself said what appears in each passage. Do you accept that for each passage? If not, why not? And how do you reconcile your continuing to be a believer with this rejection of at least some of your faith's divinely inspired fundamental documents? And if you do accept each of these passages as accurately communicating words spoken by your God, how do you deal with serving a God who equated physical disabilities with spiritual defilement, and who said human beings may be the property of other human beings and therefore be beaten within an inch of their lives? I look forward to hearing your thoughts on this. Thanks a lot.